Hello and welcome back to High School History. I hope you have been following all the chapter revisions that I've been doing all of these weeks. If you have found them useful, I would love it if you could hit on the thumbs up button and subscribe to my channel so that the next few themes that I'm going to be putting up over the next 48 hours, you will get a notification for that as soon as I've posted those videos. Now that we have that out of the way, let's talk about Theme 7, an Imperial Capital Vijayanagara circa 14th to 16th centuries CE. The empire of Vijayanagar first comes to light in larger historical circles with the first discovery of Hampi. The ruins of Hampi were first discovered by Colin Mackenzie in the year 1800. Now, Colin Mackenzie was an engineer, he was an antiquarian by hobby, and he was an employee of the English East India Company. And he prepared the first survey map of Hampi. Now, what he saw really interested him and he wanted to find out more. He was an antiquarian after all. His first initial info came from priests of the Virupaksha temple and the shrine of Pampa Devi in the Hampi complex. From 1856 onwards, with the coming of photography to India, we begin to find photographic records of the Hampi region. And the first inscriptions began to be found and studied from the 1836 period onwards. Scholars have also taken into account foreign travelers and other kinds of literature written in Telugu, Kannada, Tamil, and Sanskrit. Now let's put this into a political context at the point. Now the empire was established in 1336. Traditionally, it is said by two brothers, Harihara and Bukka. And this empire was quite widespread. So therefore, it included people speaking different languages and belonging to different communities. You have here the Tungabhadra region, extremely fertile, and of course, a great source of water given the fact that Deccan has pretty limited sources of water. So, all of these surrounding kingdoms actually were always contesting for the fertile river valleys and the resources which were generated by the lucrative overseas trade. So, you can see that they have a long coastline here, lot of important ports, and therefore a lot of foreign trade happening. And it only made sense for the Deccan kingdoms to try and control trade. But apart from conflict, the interactions that these kingdoms had also led to exchange of ideas, especially in architecture, as we shall see some details later on. The rulers of Vijayanagar were called Raya, and one of their most visible forms of involvement was temple building traditions. And when you look at southern Indian temples and their high shikharas and gopurams, most of them had actually been added during the Vijayanagar period. Now let's look at how trade was extremely important for the Vijayanagar Empire. Now, fertile land was limited only to some coastal areas and, of course, the river valleys. Deccan, by its own geography, is quite dry. They do not have any perennial rivers, so sources of water can get pretty tough to find. Therefore, agriculture could never really become the mainstay of a state's economy, and it could never really generate enough revenue that a kingdom would need. So, therefore, trade became an extremely important economic activity and also a source of revenue generation. Now, one very important item of trade over which the state had control was horses. Now, India does not have any native breeds of horses. Whatever horses we have been imported from outside, either now or in the past. Now, most of the good horses came from Arabia and Central Asia, and these would be really important for the kingdoms because remember in the previous slide we talked about conflict between these neighboring kingdoms in the Deccan, and horses would be a very important part of the army. So each of these states, including Vijayanagar, they had to keep control over the trade of horses. So actually the state had monopoly. No, any individual trader could not actually buy and sell horses. And obviously all the neighboring kingdoms also wanted the best horses. So each of these kingdoms tried to find different ways in which they would encourage the traders, the horse traders, to come and trade with their kingdom and not the others. Among the traders, those who enjoyed a lot of prestige were, of course, the Arab traders, the Kudirei Chetty, who were some of the most prosperous traders and merchants of southern India. Then there, of course, were the Portuguese who started coming into India after 1498. And unlike northern India, where trade never really enjoyed a lot of social prestige, in southern India, traders were a much respected community. And the markets were filled with spices, textiles, and precious stones, among the myriad other things that were traded from these ports. Now, let's look at a quick lowdown on the political developments in the Vijayanagar Empire. So in the Vijayanagar Empire, we see four major dynasties. The Sangamas, the founding dynasty from about 1336 to 1485. They were removed by the Saluvas and they established their rule from 1485 and continued till 1503. Then you have the Tuluva dynasty who supplanted the Saluvas, who lasted from 1503 to 1542. And Krishnadeva Raya was the greatest king of the Vijayanagar Empire. And finally, you had the Aravidu, who ruled from 1542 to the ultimate decline of the empire itself. Now, under Krishnadeva Raya's rule, the Raichur Doab was brought under control. Raichur Doab is the area between the Doab between the Tungabhadra River and the Krishna River, extremely fertile. And this was under the control of, alternatively Orissa or Bijapur, and Vijayanagar was able to bring it under their control. Krishnadevaraya also was also added impressive gopurams or gateways to pre-existing temples. Temple building, of course, had been a huge project undertaken by most southern Indian kingdoms. He also established Nagalapuram, which was named after his brother at the outs. I'm sorry, this was named after his mother. I will make the change before I post the link. At the outskirts of the capital of Vijayanagar. Um, then, of course, the kingdom began to face strain after his death. We have records of a large number of rebellions with the Nayakas. Then there was the alliance of the Sultanates against Vijayanagar, and ultimately in 1565, the Battle of Talikota was fought, where Ramaraya, who was the prime minister of the Vijayanagar kingdom, was defeated by the Sultanate alliance. Vijayanagar, of course, was sacked as part of this war, and after a few years, the capital was completely abandoned. This marked the beginning of the decline of the Vijayanagar Empire. So the Aravidu dynasty takes their capital eastwards and they move to Pendukonda, and later on they start ruling from Chandragiri, which is near Tirupati. Now let's look at the foreign policy of Vijayanagar. Now, they have fought a lot of wars with their neighbors, but largely these wars were never religious in nature. Very few times do you have even references to war being fought for religion. Largely, it was conflict for resources. For example, the Raichur Doab. In fact, often the relationship between the sultanates and Vijayanagar was also one of cooperation. For example, Krishnadevaraya supported some claimants to the throne in the sultanates, and the title establisher of the Yavana kingdom was given to him. In fact, there was also a time when the Sultan of Bijapur resolved the succession disputes in Vijayanagar after the death of Krishnadevaraya. Now, who were these Rayas and the Nayakas? The Rayas, of course, were the rulers of Vijayanagar, and the Nayakas were the military chiefs under the Rayas. Now, they had a very hot and cold kind of a relationship. Um, the Nayakas would control forts and they would have their own armies and supporters. They moved from place to place, often along with peasants, looking for fertile lands on which to settle in. The Nayakas spoke either Telugu or Kannada, and though they did submit to the Rayas, but often when the Rayas were weak, the Nayakas could rebel as well. In fact, when you look at the succession of dynasties in the Vijayanagar area, many of the newer dynasties were actually Nayakas of the previous dynasties. Now let's look at the Amaranayaka system. It was a major political innovation that we see in Vijayanagar, most likely derived from the Ikta system of the Delhi Sultanate. So what did the Raya do? He gave these military commanders or the Nayakas some territories to govern. The Nayakas were allowed to collect taxes and revenue from the peasants and traders, and they retained part of these collections for their own expenses. The Nayakas were also required to maintain their own contingents, including horses and elephants, which were to be provided when the Raya went to war. And this establishment, this structure of the Amaranayaka, was instrumental in empire expansion. That without any direct expenses, the rulers of Vijayanagar were able to raise a huge army at a very short, within a very short stretch of time. The Nayakas were also expected to maintain irrigation tanks and temples which lay within their territories. They were required to send an annual tribute and make a personal appearance in the royal court, and they were expected to give gifts to the king to show loyalty. Now, if the center became weak, the Amaranayaka would rebel and often set up independent kingdoms. Now, let's start looking at the archaeological evidence that we have from Hampi. Now, this is a rough layout of the Hampi region. The first very important thing that we need to talk about is water resources. Vijayanagar was always short on water. So they had to find different methods of bringing water into the city. So obviously we have the Tungabhadra river flowing north of the capital, and this was the main source of water. But again, these are not perennial rivers, so summer months can be pretty tough. So what the kings began to do is, since the Vijayanagar capital region was also ringed by a lot of granite hills, during the rainy season, you would have a lot of these streams which would come up. So what they did was they dug a bit and they would use these seasonal streams to act as feeders to various tanks. Now, this you can see is the Kamalapura tank. It's actually a huge tank which exists even today. This was built by the kings, and or the water from the surrounding hills were actually redirected towards Kamalapura. It still works that way. Now, how do you get the water from here into the urban and the royal centers? So you used aqueducts, right? So you have got these pillars and you have this channel resting on that, all built of stone masonry. So they would be organized at a descending height, and they would bring in water into the royal center and the urban core. The Hirya Canal was built by the Sangama kings, and this also brought in water from the Tungabhadra river into the farms which were placed right within the city. Let's look at the fortifications. Now, Abdul Razak was a Persian ambassador who spent some time in the Deccan, and he reports that there were 7 lines of fortifications. And he says that between the first, second, and third walls, he means the outer walls, there are cultivated fields, gardens, and houses. This fact is corroborated by the Portuguese traveler Domingo Paes as well. And he says that these encircled not only the town but also farmlands and forest. The granite hills which surround the capital were also part of the fortification. So they kind of, use the walls as natural fortification. And if there was a gap between two hills, that is where they would raise their walls. The walls were all masonry constructions with walls tapering at the top. So they were thicker at the bottom and narrower at the top. It serves 2 functions. One, it creates an optical illusion of height. So the walls appear higher than they actually are. And second, the base of the wall where the enemy would first come and hit was very wide. So it was very difficult to breach the walls at the lower levels as well. Now, when we've studied the walls further, we found that there was no mortar or cementing agent used in the building of these walls. These walls are rubble packed. So there are 2 layers of construction, and between the 2 layers of the stones, you have packed them with earth and rubble, which actually makes a wall much stronger. And they have outward projecting bastions, which could be square or rectangular in shape. The first line of fortifications, as far as the archaeologists have studied, they were around farms. So we found archaeological evidence of farms as well. The second line was found around the inner urban complex. The third line was around the royal center, and each major structure had its own walls as well. So intense fortification is one of the main features of the Vijayanagar, of the city of Vijayanagar or Hampi. Now the question is, why would there be fields within forts? I mean, wouldn't that be a very expensive thing? I mean, how large what a lot of fortifications you would have had to build. Now, when we look at the goal of medieval sieges, it was to starve the defenders into submission. That how long will those sitting inside the fort really last out? I mean, they will ultimately run out of food. Sieges could last months or years, but rulers tried to be prepared by constructing huge granaries and keeping them well stocked. But if you don't have a ready supply or a continuous supply of food coming in, they will eventually run out. But if you put fields within the fortifications, you can, in theory, have an endless supply of food, and the siege can last for as long as you want. Let's come to roads. So, how do we trace roads? We don't have a lot of evidence, but we do have some other indirect evidence that can be used. We definitely see a lot of gates, and they seem to be well guarded. And these gates linked the inner streets to the major roads of the empire. The gateways had arches and domes inspired by the Indo Islamic architecture, and the roads could be traced through these gates and tracking some pavements that we see. A lot of these roads wind around the hilly areas, avoiding digging right through the hills, but around they built them around them. And the most important roads of the city were those which led to temples, and these were lined on either side by what the archaeologists have called shops. Right, so this was a road perhaps leading to the Virupaksha temple. Let's come to the urban core. Now, we don't have a lot of evidence for the houses of ordinary people. We have found some Chinese porcelain in the northeast corner of the city, and we are assuming that it was also the Muslim residential quarter. Now, how do we say that? Because we found a lot of mosques and Muslim tombs in this region. And the mosques, interestingly, are constructed like mandapas. They do not have domes or minarets, but they look more like mandapas of the temple halls. Now, Barbosa says that the houses of ordinary people were built of thatch and they were arranged according to occupation. Even today, when you go to some of the older cities and older towns of South India, you will have a weaver's quarter, you will have a blacksmith's quarter. Yes. So, Hampi also seems to have been organized in a similar way. In the urban core, we have hundreds of big and small shrines which indicate the existence of a large number of cults. And rainwater tanks and temple tanks provided water to the ordinary people. Now, the royal center lies to the southwestern part of the capital. It has more than 60 shrines, right? And this perhaps indicates royal support to cults as a way of legitimizing their rule. One, gaining the support of the people, and two, to legitimize their rules that see all these gods and goddesses are actually supporting our rule. There are 30 buildings which have been classified as palaces. The temples are entirely built of masonry, and the superstructure of the secular buildings classified as palaces were made of perishable materials, except a few. So you would have a masonry base on which you would raise wooden posts and use thatch roofs and walls. Some of the most interesting structures within the royal enclosure or the royal center is the Mahanavami Dibba. In fact, there's not one such platform but two. So the largest enclosure in the royal center is called palace, but we have no conclusive proof that whether this was used as the royal family's residence. The entire enclosure is surrounded by high double walls, and they're really high. There are two impressive platforms. One is called the audience hall and the other is called the Mahanavami Dibba. Now, the audience hall is not as high or as large as the Mahanavami Dibba. And when we look at the top of the platform, there are slots of wooden pillars. We've also found stairs going up to the second floor, and most likely the second floor must have rested on the wooden pillars. Today, of course, the wooden pillars and the second floor do not exist. Now, when we look at the pillars in the audience hall, we see that they are placed very close to each other, and it would really obstruct the view. So the audience sitting in the hall would not have a clear view of the king, and the king also would not have a clear view of the people there. So historians have questioned today whether we can still call it the audience hall. Then, of course, we have what is called the Mahanavami Dibba. It's a massive platform. The base is about 11,000 square feet. It's a height of 40 feet. And there is evidence that it supported a wooden superstructure as well. The base of the platform is covered with relief carvings of animals, war scenes, and so on. Now, the question is, why was this Mahanavami Dibba built? What was its purpose? So, some historians have argued that maybe they were used for rituals associated with Mahanavami during the 10-day Dashera festival. We know that Vijayanagar has a long tradition of celebrating the Dashera festival, which is known by different names around the country. The Navratras in North India, Durga Puja in Eastern India. And this festival was used to display the Rayas' prestige, power, and suzerainty. Perhaps they worship the image of the goddess and the state horse. Maybe they sacrificed buffaloes and other animals. Perhaps dances and wrestling matches were conducted. Maybe in front of the Mahanavami Dibba, there were processions of caparisoned horses, elephants, and chariots and soldiers. Maybe there were ritual presentations before the king and his guests by the chief Nayakas and the subordinate kings. Now, on the last day of the festival, the king may have inspected his army and the armies of the Nayakas in a grand ceremony in an open field. On this occasion, the Nayakas perhaps brought in rich gifts for the king as well as the stipulated tribute. Please note how I'm saying perhaps and maybe, because some historians have argued that the space around the Mahanavami Dibba may not have allowed for such grand displays. So again, at best, we can only make some informed guesses, but largely the Mahanavami Dibba remains enigmatic. There were many other beautiful buildings in the royal center. One is the Lotus Mahal. We don't really know what it was used for. It's really a gallery with a top story. Colin Mackenzie suggested that this may have been used as a chamber for the council where the king would meet his advisors. And then you also have the Hazar Ram temple. So why was it called Hazar Ram? It's really been called Hazar Ram by the archaeologists who discovered it. largely perhaps because the walls of the temples actually recount the story of the Ramayana. Now let's come to the sacred center. Now, why would the rulers of Vijayanagar choose Hampi as their capital? Now, traditionally, this area has been known to be contiguous with the monkey kingdom of Vali and Sugri from the Ramayana. Traditions tell us that Pampa Devi performed many penances in this region to marry Virupaksha, who is seen as a form of Shiva, who's the protector of the kingdom. We also have a lot of Jain temples in the vicinity. So this seems to have been, associated. The site seems to have been associated with a lot of different traditions, and perhaps that is one of the reasons why the Vijayanagar kings chose this as their capital. Now, temple building was a very, very important tradition, and the kings associated themselves through temple building with divinity and gaining legitimacy for their rule. The temples, in turn, would also receive huge land grants from the kings and eventually developed as significant religious, social, cultural, and economic centers. Vijayanagar kings claimed to rule on the behalf of the god Virupaksha, and all royal orders were signed Sri Virupaksha. And the title of Hindu Suratrana or Hindu Sultan was also used by quite a few of the kings. When the king visited the temple, it was supposed to be a special state occasion. So processions were organized and gifts were given away, and you have inscriptions which record the event. We have something called the Raya Gopuram. These were the royal gateways. So these were new gateways added by the Vijayanagar kingdoms to perhaps pre-existing temples, because often you see that the gateways are higher than the temple itself. Very, very richly decorated gateways. Now, why would they build such high gateways? Perhaps to announce the presence of a temple from a distance. So, as people were coming in from far away, they could figure out that there was this large temple situated ahead. There were mandapas or pavilions and long pillared corridors that often ran around the shrines within the temple complex. So, around the outer wall, they would have, galleries and halls and so on. Perhaps for the devotees coming and resting there, or maybe to perform different rituals. When we look at the Virupaksha temple, we have a hall in front of the main shrine, which was built by Krishna Deva Raya to mark his ascension to the throne. He also is supposed to have built the eastern gateway, which is the main gateway through which we enter into the temple even today. The mandapas were used for many things, such as marriages of the gods, performances of dance and music as offerings to the god. Vitthala Temple. So, Vitthala is a form of Vishnu, and this is the main Vitthala Temple, and you can see mandapas not only in front of the temple but also on either side. And right in front of the Vitthala Temple, you also have a shrine in the shape of a chariot. And here you can see some of the granite hills in the background. This largely encircles the entire capital of Hampi. Now, when archaeologists are excavating, how do they plot palaces, temples, and bazaars and start their excavation process? So, in 1976, Hampi was recognized as a site of national importance. It is today a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And we have a lot of photographs, old plans, elevation of structures and sculptures, and also foreign travelers' accounts to understand this site. But to understand the layout, the first step that the archaeologists do is to divide the entire area into a set of 25 squares. So 5 by 5 squares each, and each square is designated by the letter of the alphabet A to Z except for I. I is not used. Each of then these squares, which they've been numbered A, B, C, D, and so on, are further subdivided into sets of even smaller squares. And again, the same. So you will have the smaller squares being called AA, AB, AC, AD, and so on. And each of these smaller squares could be further subdivided into yet smaller units. And these were used to map out roads, bazaars, temples, etc. To further excavate. Now, some of the early archaeologists here, John M. Fritz, George Michel, and M.S. Nagaraj Rao, after they excavated this region, they said that in our study of these monuments of Vijayanagar, we have to imagine a whole series of vanished wooden elements, columns, brackets, beams, ceilings, overhanging eaves, and the towers, decorated with plaster and painted perhaps brightly. Something that you see in temples even today. So maybe that tradition is an old one. Now, questions need to be asked to get some answers. Now, when buildings survive, they tell us about the way the space was organized and used, how they were built, what materials were used, what technology was used to build these structures. These structures also hint at the spread of ideas and cultural influences. Like, for example, when we were talking about the gateways through each of the layers of the walls of the Hampi, the gateways were built in a more Indo Islamic format with arches and domes. Often, to understand purposes of buildings or the decorations of buildings, we need to combine information from other sources like literature, inscriptions, and popular traditions, like we saw in chapter 4. Now, some questions to ask are these. Now, would commoners have had access to any of these areas within the royal center or the sacred center? Could they freely come and go, or was access limited? Would they hurry past the sculpture or the architecture, or would they pause to see and reflect and try to understand its complicated symbolism? And what are the people who worked on these colossal constructions think of the enterprises to which they had contributed the labor? So, the masons, the architects, what did they think about what they had created? So, these are some of the key questions which we need to ask and need to find the answers to. I hope today's session has been helpful. I'll be posting the next chapter very soon, so be alert and all the best.